In my family, silence is how judgment dresses for dinner. They don't scream, they don't argue, they slice with smiles and clink of glassware. At that table status is a currency, and I've been bankrupt in their eyes since the day I enlisted. My name is Evelyn Callan. I served 12 years in military intelligence, 3 deployments, 2 commendations, 1 medal I never showed them. I built a cybersecurity firm from scratch after leaving the service, no press, no headlines, just contracts, encrypted code, and quiet results. Still to them, I'm the daughter who didn't go to law school, the one who wore boots instead of heels. So when I walked into the dining room that Thanksgiving, wearing a plain coat and no makeup, no one stood up. No one asked how I was. My mother glanced over her wine glass and offered the kind of smile people reserve for strangers they don't plan to speak to twice. I hung my coat behind the chair at the end of the table, the chair that's always somehow open even when the guest list is full. And as I sat down beside the dying centerpiece, no one bothered to water since 2019, I could feel it already. The verdict forming. They thought I was here to eat. They had no idea I brought the truth with me, folded inside my jacket pocket. The roast was already on the table when I sat down, brushed with some herb glaze that smelled more performative than delicious. Across from me, Grant was already halfway through his second glass of Pinot and mid-story about his newest client, a pro athlete facing tax evasion charges. No one seemed to notice I'd arrived, which was fitting. I didn't expect a parade. I just didn't expect to feel like an afterthought at my own childhood dining table. My mother's voice cut through the clatter of silverware. "You made it," she said, not looking at me. "Wasn't sure if your schedule would allow it, what with whatever you do these days." That earned a few amused glances from my cousins. Grant smirked. "Still doing that military-adjacent stuff, Evie?" He gestured with his wine, like it doubled as a pointer. "Thought you retired from playing soldier." I didn't answer. I just reached for the water pitcher. Silence made them uncomfortable. It made me calm. From the far end, Aunt Sylvia jumped in. "You know my Thomas just got promoted to associate partner, second youngest at the firm." She beamed at no one in particular, then added, "He interned for a federal judge last year. It really opened doors." I nodded, not because I cared, but because I'd learned a long time ago that nodding was less work than pretending to be impressed. "Elise bought a townhome in Alexandria," someone added, "near the riverfront." "That's lovely," I said, spooning stuffing onto my plate without tasting it. The conversation swirled around me, like wind skimming a glass wall, loud, persistent, unable to land. They went on about rising property taxes, crypto markets, someone's renovation in Bethesda. Not one question about what I'd been doing. Not one mention of the years I'd disappeared into contracts and combat zones, or how I hadn't brought a single holiday card because there was no address stable enough to receive one. My father sat 2 seats down, quiet as always. He hadn't looked at me since I arrived, but I saw his eyes flick toward my hands when I reached for the bread. No wedding ring, no manicure, just calluses and short, clean nails. Not the kind of hands this family considered feminine, not the kind that graced Christmas newsletters. Then Clara, my cousin's daughter, barely 13, and glued to her phone, looked up and said, "Weren't you in Najaf that year? The big thing on TikTok, I think they mentioned a female officer." The whole table paused. I didn't move. Grant chuckled awkwardly. "Yeah, right. Like Evie was in that mission." I folded my napkin on my lap. No one noticed how my father's hand tightened just slightly on his fork, or how my jacket draped over the chair behind me shifted with the draft from the kitchen door. The lining had loosened, and somewhere beneath it, silver was starting to catch the light. Dad noticed it first. Not with words, with stillness. He set his fork down gently, eyes fixed on the corner of my jacket, like he'd just spotted something he wasn't sure was real. For a moment, I thought he might say nothing, might let the moment pass the way so many had in our family, unspoken, buried under polite indifference. But then he leaned forward. His voice was low, careful. "That's not a bronze star?" Every conversation at the table halted like someone had pulled the emergency brake on a train. I didn't answer right away, just adjusted the napkin on my lap like I hadn't heard him, like maybe we were talking about the weather. It's not, I finally said. Grant frowned. Wait, what? Dad sat back slightly, his gaze never leaving my coat. Silver, I gave the faintest nod. The silence that followed wasn't shocked, not yet. It was skeptical, calculating. Like everyone around the table was collectively trying to recall if that metal meant what they thought it did. Hold on, Elise said. You actually earned that. Isn't that pretty high? It's second, Clara answered before I could. Second highest. She blinked at me, like she was seeing a shape take form that had always been a blur in her periphery. Grant let out a soft scoff. No offense, Evie, but how would you end up with something like that? I mean, no one ever said, no one ever asked, I replied. That shut him up for all of 5 seconds. But you've never even told us what you really did over there, he pressed. Weren't you just support? I looked at him then. Not angry, just flat. Najaf. 2016. Our unit was down 1 extraction team. Local comms were cut. We were told to stand by. Dad's face stiffened. I didn't. I ran point. We pulled out 17, lost 2, no air cover, no backup, just judgment calls and burned rubber. Elise shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Sylvia clutched her wineglass a little tighter. No one reached for the sweet potatoes. My mother finally spoke, her tone clipped but controlled. You never said a word. Would it have changed anything? I asked. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The image was still there, reflecting faintly off the chandelier metal ribbon edge of memory. I remembered holding that same medal in my hand the night they pinned it to my uniform, thinking how heavy it felt for something so small. Not from weight, from what it cost. The 3 names that didn't come home. The blood that didn't wash out of my boots until a month later. The fact that I hadn't heard from my team in years, not because we didn't care, but because some bonds are forged so tight they don't need checking. And now, after all this time, that small piece of engraved metal had finally entered the one room it was never meant to enter. This dining room, with these people, and it was already doing what words never could. For a moment, no one spoke. No knives scraping plates, no passive-aggressive clinks of wine glasses, just the muffled hum of the dishwasher running in the background, and a draft that made the candle at the center of the table flicker. My mother's voice broke the quiet, as brittle as the edge of her ceramic tone. So that's where you've been all these years, running off into classified missions. She said it like it was a phase, like deployments were some extended gap year I'd taken to find myself. I didn't flinch. I was doing my job. Grant chuckled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Sure, but come on, what kind of job gets you that? You were in intelligence, not Rambo. I stared at him. You know what the hardest part about intelligence work is? It's not the danger. It's convincing civilians that silence isn't failure. That landed heavier than I thought it would. Dad leaned forward. His voice was low but deliberate. Why didn't you ever tell us? I met his gaze. Because I knew how it would go. One of you would ask if it was real. The others would ask why I didn't just come home sooner. Clara, still gripping her phone like it might explain the room for her, looked between us. But you were the officer in that story, the one they called Ghost Commander. That was real? I gave the faintest nod. Yeah. My mother blinked. Something shifted in her face like a memory uncoiling from the wrong corner of her mind. I remember that article, she said slowly, brows drawing tight. It was buried under the Senate budget hearings. The story said the officer disobeyed direct command and went in anyway. Saved the squad. But it was anonymous. Command refused to release the name. I tilted my head slightly. You wrote about it. Her breath caught. You quoted a colonel, said it was the most precise field decision he'd seen in 10 years. Said she didn't follow orders, she followed the mission. The room turned colder. Everyone turned toward her. Dad's voice was barely a whisper. You wrote about your own daughter. She looked down at her lap, stunned. You framed that quote, I said, my voice flat. Hung it in your office, but never once asked if I could have been the one behind it. I didn't know, she said weakly. You didn't want to, I corrected. There was no rage in my tone. Just fact. the kind that sat too close to be denied. Clara looked over at me with something softer now, not curiosity. Recognition. For years, I'd let them believe I was the absence in the room, the failure, the blank space on the family tree that no one filled in. But tonight, the story was writing itself differently. And for once, they were the ones left without the words. My mother didn't speak for a while. She just stared at the rim of her wine glass, like the Merlot might offer some alternate version of reality she could still cling to. I remember the Colonel's quote, she said finally, voice barely audible. I used it as the closing line. It made me believe journalism still meant something. I nodded slowly. It did. You just didn't realize who you were writing about. Grant shifted in his seat. Wait, back up. That was you, the whole thing. The article said the officer disobeyed the evac protocol, risked airspace violation, even went dark on comms for 12 minutes. That's not just guts, that's borderline insubordination. Elise, I said calmly, sometimes command says, wait. And if I had waited, 17 people would have died. No one argued with that. Dad leaned back in his chair, one hand resting lightly on the edge of his plate. His voice was quiet but clear. They called her reckless, didn't they? I remember the chatter. Said whoever did it should have been court-martialed. I looked at him directly. That's what made the medal hard to carry. Across the table, Aunt Sylvia tried to rescue the moment with a brittle laugh. Well, isn't that something? We have a hero in the family, and didn't even know it. I didn't smile. Clara spoke again, her voice small. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? I looked at her. Because I didn't need a standing ovation. I needed a reason to keep going. Elise picked at her mashed potatoes like they'd suddenly become fascinating. Grant was quieter now. Even his watch didn't seem to glint as confidently under the chandelier. My mother finally looked at me, not past me, not through me. At me. I quoted you, she said. For years I told people that line, she didn't follow orders. She followed the mission. It's on my website. I didn't flinch. You built a reputation on a moment I lived through, one that nearly killed me. Her jaw tensed. I didn't know it was you. No, I said. But you never thought it could be. That one landed. She turned her face slightly, not in shame, but in realization. Her own bias, printed in black and white, framed on a wall, now looking back at her, with eyes she'd seen every Thanksgiving and never once truly recognized. You always assumed courage came in someone else's form. Someone taller, louder, male. The room held its breath. Then Dad spoke again, his voice gentler than before. I used to show you pictures of that medal when you were a kid. Told you about Captain Ames. Told you what it meant. That it wasn't given, it was earned. I looked at him. You said it was for moments that defined a person. He nodded once. And you had one. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in this house, I didn't feel like I had to convince anyone of who I was. They were finally starting to see me. Not as a story, but as the source. Grant cleared his throat like he'd been waiting for the room to exhale before he made his next move. Okay, so you've got a medal. Impressive. But you said you consult now. What does that even mean? I reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone. One tap, then another. The company dashboard glowed across the screen. I slid it across the table to him. He squinted. Elise leaned in. Aunt Sylvia adjusted her glasses. Helix Sentinel. Active contract $220. U.S. Department of Defense. Clara let out a sharp breath. Wait, that's your company. I didn't respond. The silence answered for me. Elise blinked fast. You're not just in it. You run it. I co-founded it, I said. We specialize in preemptive threat modeling for critical infrastructure. Cyber warfare defense, federal level. Grant looked at me like I'd spoken in another language. But you don't even post on LinkedIn. That's kind of the point. Dad looked down at the screen again, lips parting just slightly. This is real top clearance, I said. We were brought in after the joint signal breach last spring. Our code flagged the first anomaly. No one had anything clever to say after that. Elise whispered, Why didn't you ever say anything? I leaned back in my chair. Because then it becomes about the resume, not the work. Across the table, my mother stared at the phone, as if it were a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. They'd spent years writing me out of the family narrative. Turns out, I'd been writing code that rewrote their entire concept of power. I reached beneath the table and drew out a small velvet box from my bag. No ceremony, no speech. Just one clean motion, like I was sliding a salt shaker toward the center of the table. I placed it in front of my mother, the soft blue velvet catching a shard of chandelier light. She stared at it, unmoving. "What is that? Open it." Her fingers hesitated, trembling slightly, as they gripped the edges. The lid gave a quiet click as it released. Inside sat a replica of the medal tucked into my coat, the silver star engraved and mounted on a regulation base, no embellishment required. She froze. This isn't yours." "It's not the one I earned," I said. "That one stays in my safe. This one's for you." Her eyes lifted slow and unsure. "Why would you give me this?" I kept my voice level. "Because you wrote the article. Because you hung the quote. I thought maybe it was time the story matched the artifact." Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her hands folded over the box, like she didn't trust it not to vanish. Dad leaned forward, eyes still on the medal. "You're giving that to her?" I nodded. "She already built a frame for the moment. I'm just giving her the rest of it." For a beat, no one said anything. Then, Elise spoke up, voice low. "I can't believe all this time. We thought you were barely making rent, that you'd just faded out." "I didn't fade," I said. "You stopped looking." My mother blinked fast, as if something behind her eyes had started to sting. "I didn't mean to, you didn't mean to ask. You didn't mean to wonder. You didn't mean to believe I was anything but the one who disappointed you. I thought you left," she whispered. "For good." "I did leave," I replied. "I just didn't vanish." Across the table, Grant was suddenly very interested in his napkin. Aunt Sylvia poured herself more wine. Clara looked like she was memorizing the entire moment, small hands folded tight in her lap, eyes flicking between the box and my face. I glanced down at the replica. It wasn't a trophy, it was a mirror, and I was holding it up to the woman who once told me to go be a soldier. If I was so determined, just don't come crying back when it breaks you. I never cried. And I didn't break. But I remembered. And this time, I made sure she did too. Dad rested his hands on the table, eyes fixed on the medal, like it might explain the past 10 years. "I used to show you pictures of that," he said quietly. "Told you it was the kind of honor you don't just wear. You carry it." I nodded. "I did." Then I pulled out one more box, smaller, darker, and slid it toward him. He opened it slowly. A watch. The same model he used to stare at in the Geneva catalog when I was a kid. Limited edition. He never bought it. Said perfection wasn't meant for him. "You taught me to respect precision," I said. It stuck. His breath caught. He didn't speak, but his hand hovered over the watch like it was something sacred. The room had changed. No one said it aloud, but I saw it in the way Elise avoided my eyes, how Grant tapped his empty glass with a finger that didn't know what else to do. Even Mom was silent, her napkin clenched too tightly in her lap. I stood. The replica medal still sat in front of her like a mirror she couldn't look into. Dad raised his glass. "To Evelyn." I shook my head. "Don't toast me. Toast the ones who didn't come back." And I walked out. No spotlight, no vindication speech, just a quiet departure from a table that never saved me a seat until now. I didn't need applause. I just needed them to see what silence built.